please wait for her to start, maybe.
Okay. Professor, dobro
Tell
večer.
me. Dobro večer. Oh, your Serbian is going well. You two are still in Kragujevac. Dragica told me that you were in Kragujevac, yes?
Yeah.
But what are you doing in Kragujevac?
I completed a master's from Faculty of Economics.
Okay.
Management.
Yeah, nice.
And now,
So basically everybody...
Now looking for job.
Okay. I always think that there's more work, but I don't really know. There's probably more work in Belgrade. Are you looking for work in Belgrade or in Kragujevac?
Basically, my graduation ceremony is 16th December this month, and after that I will back to Belgrade, shipped to Belgrade from Kragujevac.
Yeah. No, that would be good.
Znači, ne znam kako da ti...
Pa izaći ću ja po nju, samo da dođe na parking. Da. Jelena is somewhere nearby. Evo me, dolazim ja, Jelena.
Nisam sigurna, da li izašao čovjek.
Hvala.
Ne znam. Ne mi pojma. Znači, znaš što je to? To je kada se ide, znači ona ide gdje je rampa dole. Eto, ajde.
Ali se nisu cijepili, da?
Ćao. Ćeš podme?
Imam čokoladu. Can't offer chocolate to those online, but those who are here, there is some chocolate from Spain. We had a conference last week. A lot of people was here, and a good friend from Spain brought some chocolate. So if you're not allergic to nuts, I actually really like it because there isn't much chocolate. There's mostly nuts. So try it if you... I was offering coffee. Nobody wants coffee at 6 o'clock.
I want coffee.
You want coffee? Yeah.
I desperately need it.
I drank too. I probably won't be able to sleep.
Nisam ovdje nikad bila. Da.
Hej, Bala. Nećeš ga cingati.
Jaj. Slušaj, kako prošlo?
Pa super je. I sad sam sa događaja, pa sam mrtva. Ali super. Ja sam očekivala da će biti više ljudi, ali danas na panelima bukvalno to isti.
A pa na konferenciji?
Da, konferencija nam je do nedelje. Tako da...
Wow, 4 dana. Ste udarati?
Pa slavimo 30 godina. I onda je lezbijska nedelja.
A da, jest.
Da. Tako da je super, mislim, naš ovdje na panelima imaš baš kao šako jada ljudi, međutim tu ne pisala. Briljento.
Bravo.
Šta je ovo? Halo? Una, jel nas čuješ? Čujem vas.
U kojoj je to prostoriji?
Ne znamo. Jel nas čuješ bolje ovako kad priđemo ovom mikrofonu?
Pa, čujete se okej?
Going night. Ne, ušo izaš. Čovjek je dobro.
Ona, jel se nis čuješ? Ja, Baš koliko mi treba kada.
Joj, ne, nema šanse. Jel imaju li neki pravni podcast? Pa
Ne znam, ne, nije mi jasno. Baš delo je kao prostor za podcast.
je ovo neki prostor za podcast? Hvala.
Ovo je moj centar pravna znanja, ali može podcast da se snima.
Zašto imaju mikrofone?
Imaju, da, pa mislim rade, sve su upaljeni. Pa snima se, da, nekad se snimaju podcast, snimaju se ovi nekad i pravnog fakulteta. Viš, dosta ljudi ima online, čovječe.
Pa da, ne znam ko je Rachel.
Da.
Da, je ovo i nestade. Među vreme. Dobro, let us then start not to take too much of your time because it's Friday evening and nobody likes lessons in Friday evening. Just confirm to me once again that you can hear me and I can start this recording. Dragica told me that the recording of the lecture is kind of helpful to students. Can anybody confirm? Alexander?
We can hear you fine.
We can hear you.
Absolutely perfect, because I can't see you, so yeah. I'm going to start the recording, and wait a second just to find it on WebEx. WebEx is finally fixed. Yeah, here it is. Record, good.
This meeting is being transcribed and summarized.
Okay, so far I think that Dragica was the only one to give you lessons. Did somebody else give you lessons in this module, in this topic? So the idea of the course is to have some overview of political feminist theories, or political feminist philosophy, and an overview of legal feminist philosophy. So basically, Dragica will take care of the political philosophy part, and Miodrag Jovanović and I will take care of the legal philosophy part. So in this legal philosophy part, we will start just by outlining today some feminist legal theories. And just to turn this off so my notifications don't bother me. And we are going to talk basically about, you'll be able to recognize, if you were talking to Dragica, some of the strains of feminist thought that we had in the last century. But before that, I will suppose in these first couple of slides that you didn't do philosophy of law in your studies. So just with a short explanation. So what do we do usually when we do theory and philosophy of law? Traditionally, we split our discipline into two major branches. So one branch is analytical or descriptive jurisprudence. And basically it's the same. When I say jurisprudence, it's just the Anglo-American way of saying philosophy or theory of law. The idea of this analytical jurisprudence is to analyze the essence of law, legal concepts, clarify legal institutions, and we discuss things like authority, power in law, obligation, and guilt, and so on and so on. So the basic legal concepts are basically the thing, their elucidation is the thing that we usually do. And within this, what I called in these slides insider jurisprudence, we do also a lot of normative jurisprudence. The idea of this normative jurisprudence is to examine some evaluative or normative or in any other way prescriptive issues. So from the perspective of philosophy of law, from the standpoint of the participants in the legal system, you can do your job in these two ways, either by analytical jurisprudence or by normative jurisprudence. Now, what we are going to talk about today is something that I term in this presentation outsider jurisprudence. Outsider jurisprudence is basically a perspective in legal theory that emphasizes usually the role of power and social context in shaping law. So our question is not anymore, let's clarify legal concepts, let's see how law should be, like in analytical and normative jurisprudence. Our main issue is from the outside perspective of law to analyze how law regulates certain social practices. Is that justifiable from that perspective, from the perspective of those social practices? And what are the power relations that are either regulated by law or constituted by law? Now, the idea of this outsider jurisprudence, because we don't deal much with this in philosophy of law or jurisprudence proper, is that basically law is an amalgam of social power. So there are some social forces that formulate law in the way in which the law is. Now, one corollary of this view is usually that a law either changes the power positions that are existing in a society or reinforces the already existing power positions within a society. So basically, a law is a mean of social control from the outsider perspective. You use law in order to kind of institutionalize certain relations within a society. Also, just to mention it, legal reasoning is a topic of insider jurisprudence, but it can also be a topic of this outsider jurisprudence or critical theory of law, as I term it, because reasoning is an especially important part of theorizing law. It is important because usually law is realized by enacting judicial decisions, by reasoning on certain legal texts and on certain facts in order to reach certain judicial decisions. I think that you will also have one of the courses is feminist judgments, is it?
Mm-hmm, yeah.
That will be very interesting. We'll do something similar today. I'll use a very concrete example from Italian law from the end of the 19th century, in the beginning, 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. That might be interesting for you. But the idea is still that both insider jurisprudence and outsider jurisprudence, or this normative analytical legal theory or jurisprudence and critical theory of law, also not only do these general legal things, they also do legal reasoning proper, in the sense that legal reasoning also influences these power relations and can change the position of persons in a certain legal case. Now, critical jurisprudence, or this outsider jurisprudence, has gained popularity in the last, let's say, 60, 70 years, or from 1970s. In fact, in 1971, it was the first time that the term feminist jurisprudence was mentioned. Otherwise, before that, you didn't have anything resembling, or at least you had things resembling already Mary Wollstonecraft in the 18th century, at the end of the 18th century. But until 71, you basically didn't have a term to encompass all these relations, feminist relations towards jurisprudence. And these critical jurisprudence strains are not really coherent. First of all, in the 70s, what emerged is something that we call critical legal studies. Basically, the entirety of these critical legal studies examines the role of ideologies and power in shaping the law and legal institutions. Now, the basic idea of critical legal studies is that law is not naturally constituted in any way, shape, or form. It's influenced by these power structures that exist in a society. Most of the inspiration for critical legal studies is leftist. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of most of them, most of the theorists are inspired by Marxism, inspired by Marxist theory, socialist theory, and so on and so on. So the second important strain, and this is also by importance, I think, this critical legal studies movement is something that I would, for example, teach my students on the 4th year of Faculty of Law in Philosophy of Law. They would have one of the lessons would be critical legal studies, and we would be discussing these topics. Now, feminist jurisprudence is similar to critical legal studies in the sense that it also researches on the role of power and ideology in shaping the law, but of course, feminist jurisprudence focuses on one certain kind of power relation, namely the relation between man and woman. That is kind of the general idea of feminist jurisprudence. And the main argument of legal theorists, the thing that they emphasize, is that law is something to be reformed in order to achieve equality between sexes or genders.
And
now,
the first one is centered around class.
Yeah, usually centered around class, critical legal studies. In the 80s, we have something that was until a couple of years ago also insanely popular in the United States. It's critical race theory. And critical race theory was popularized in the United States for various reasons. For example, from the right side, and the Trumpist MAGA crowd was claiming that they're ruining the America's kids by teaching critical race theory and so on and so on. But of course also, and the left side or the Democrats, at least part of the Democrats, thought it justified to teach power relations in terms of races. In fact, from the beginning of the 80s, racial relations have become the topic of critical legal studies heavily. And then finally, from the 90s, basically, we have something that we usually call queer legal theory. Now, for every one of these strands, I uploaded on Moodle. I uploaded it maybe like this morning, so you didn't see it along with this presentation, but you'll be able to find at least one paper. And I tried not to, I just selected Dragica's papers. Maybe I shouldn't say this for the camera because hi, Dragica, she's probably going to look at it. But I just selected 3 papers that are kind of, for me, informative. Her reader is a bit more expansive and so on. I think that these 3 papers are absolutely fine for getting the gist of this presentation and for like exploring a bit further into certain strains of legal theory, feminist legal theory, that I don't have the time to explore in 2 hours. But we'll definitely have the chance to discuss these issues further in the next couple of lessons. I think in this lesson, I'm going to basically focus on feminist jurisprudence and the dominant strands of feminist jurisprudence in the last 30 or 40 years. We are not going to go historically. We are going to discuss a case, basically. I think the next lesson will be done by Miodrag, who is going to discuss some legal concepts from a feminist perspective with you. And then finally, I think that I'm going to end this legal part of our lessons by doing some feminist movements in the last 30 or 40 years, to give you just an overview how this theory and how this change of concepts was reflected in actual activism. Now, the characteristic thing with varieties, this critical jurisprudence, is that in none of these kinds of critical jurisprudence you get like theory, plain theory, and so on. Usually all these strands are connected to activist movements, which is kind of nice when you think about it, because you have this activist part of what you teach and do in theory and philosophy of law. That's also very difficult to theorize about, because there are many strains. It's difficult to find one dominant idea of the movement. There are many dissenting opinions. It's always a mess. Somebody is an activist. You never know if somebody is writing descriptively or normatively or activistically, and so on and so on. So it's kind of difficult to teach. Okay. But the basic idea of feminist jurisprudence that we are going to talk about today is that we focus on the ways in which law has historically and continues to discriminate against women. It's plain form. I mean, I'm sure that Dragica already told you about intersectionality, that you bash the hell out of this topic, and you're going to continue to talk about this topic a lot. And justifiably so, because intersectionality from 89, since Kimberly Chainshaw wrote that paper on kind of the difference of influence of law in situations in which you have this intersectional discrimination, is rising as a topic of interest, and justifiably so, I think, because, we'll also explain why it is so in this lesson. So, feminist legal theories argue, and that is the basic point. You could put it non-analytically in the following way: law is male. But that is kind of the general idea. But if I put it less dramatically, the idea of feminist jurisprudence is that law should be reformed. We theorize about ways in which we should reform the law in order to address, to minimize, or eliminate completely gender and sex inequalities. Okay, nobody was talking about gender inequalities until basically the 80s, until Judith Butler wrote the book about gender and sex and so on and so on. So in some of these strands, you'll see that
The series.
yeah, that is good. So we will start, and I'll try to walk you through these strands, the main strands of feminist jurisprudence, by discussing this very interesting case. If you haven't watched the Netflix series, you can watch it, but it's so-so. It's not fantastic. It's nice, actually. I was happy when I saw that they were publishing a series. I wrote a paper maybe a year before the series started because I got very interested in this decision, and I'll explain you the decision. But Lydia Poet is quite a character, and you'll see why. Basically, the entire TV series is a thriller and it's completely invented. Now, the true story of Lydia Poet. Now, Poet was basically born in 1855 in a province of Italy, basically. She was the daughter of wealthy rural landowners. She was the last of 4 brothers and 3 sisters, and she moved with her brother Enrico in later years to live with him, and Enrico was a lawyer. Now, Lydia Poet grew fascinated with the job of her brother, and by staying with her brother, she learned a lot about law. And as soon as Italy allowed for women to enroll in faculties of law, she was the first Italian woman to enroll into the faculty of law. She was also the first female to finish a faculty of law. So basically, she enrolled in 1877, and it was the faculty of law at the University of Turin, graduated with fantastic, with honors in 1881. And the dissertation was on the woman's right to vote. So if you did some history of feminist movements, it's very early. You have John Stuart Mill, basically, who was writing in the 18th century. On the European continent, nobody was writing. You find the writings only in the Anglo-American world, because on the European continent, still very absolutist, still national movements. So nobody was basically writing about women's rights to vote. Now, there was an interview in Corriere della Sera, and Poet was very positive about her experience. She was the first one. She was basically cuddled by the men at the time for some reason. She wasn't rejected at the faculty. So her experience was so positive that her main wish while doing the university was to become a practicing lawyer. We would call that, in Italian also, we would say avvocato. So basically, I call it a practicing lawyer. In Britain, it would be barrister, solicitor, or whatever, but usually it's a trial lawyer, a person who can factually go to trial. Now, after graduating, she enrolled in the Register of Trainees, Practitioners of Law, or law clerks, and then did her 2 years of practice at an office of a senator. Now, in 1883, basically after 2 years after graduating, she was very diligent in her work, and she passed all the necessary examination in the Bar Association of Torino to become a trial lawyer. As all the regulations that were prescribed since 1874, she passed. She applied to the relevant association. The Bar Association voted, and they admitted her to the Bar Association. In Torino legal circles, this was the first woman in a Bar Association, and it arose great interest until somebody basically asked the prosecutor to file a case with the Turin elementary or basic court about her application in the bar association and about her enrollment in the bar association. Now, the case in front of the basic court lasted for 3 years. She fought her right to become and stay a lawyer because you can see it was like 8 votes in favor, 4 votes against. But it's trial lawyers. Trial lawyers are usually a progressive profession in law. Yeah. Now, the decision after 3 years, basically on 11th of November, the basic court, the Court of Appeal in Turin opposed her enrollment in the bar. In the end, on the 11th of November of 1883, the Court of Appeal finally upheld the decision. The decision was appealed in the Court of Cassation, that's the highest court at that time of Turin. Today there is only one in Italy, but there were, I think, 4 or 5 at the time. And the Turin Court of Cassation, after a 3-year-long public debate and court debate, upheld the decision. So, how do you become trial lawyer when you're a woman? You finish faculty of law, pass the bar exam, get an inscription, at least in the end of the 19th century. You get an inscription in the bar association, fulfill all of the relevant criteria, you personally fight in court and public for 5 years, and this was the text of the decision. Women cannot exercise the legal profession.
While exercising the legal profession. She was defending herself, so she
was represented by a lawyer. The best advice that the lawyer would give you, lawyers never represent themselves, as no one should. So somebody should always represent you. And of course, she was a good lawyer enough to have somebody represent her. Unfortunately, this decision is available in Italian. I can upload you the decision. I think that I don't have a translation in English of the decision. It's a very insanely interesting decision. I can upload you this paper. I forgot to upload it. The paper that I wrote with a colleague, Roberto Isibor from Milano. And it's about this. It's just an analysis of the opinion, but there is also a lot of fact of the case. But the opinion is very, very interesting, and the sentence is, it states basically that's the conclusion of the entire process is women cannot exercise the legal profession. Now, let us pass from this point and this decision to discussing these feminist jurisprudence, to discussing these strains of feminist jurisprudence. Now, the strains are basically nothing special. You heard about them already. And you know that within these waves, usually called the first, the second, the third wave, and so on, we distinguish between at least kind of 3, if not more, feminist perspectives or positions within the strains. The first is liberal feminism, the second this decision and how it
This
evolved.
meeting is being
Eventually, Lydia
transcribed
Poet
and
became a
summarized.
trial lawyer, but it took time, a lot of time. The main point is to do legal reforms in the way prescribed by law in order to treat women and men equally within law. So, the key ideas of liberal jurisprudence is let's reform law in order to provide us equality of opportunity. If we have equality of opportunity, the idea of liberal feminist thinkers was everything is settled, basically. So if you give us equality of opportunity, we will be able to kind of achieve at least the same levels as men in many, many areas. Especially if we remove like these legal barriers. For example, if we remove the legal barrier for women to become trial lawyers, more women will become trial lawyers. Now, legal and political reforms, they usually focus on anti-discrimination laws, equal pay legislation, policies promoting gender diversity, quotas for women in certain areas of life, in public and private institutions, leading to a more equitable society. And finally, the idea of policies and laws is a gender-neutral laws and policies, treating everybody equally, regardless of sex. This basically allows us, at least the liberal feminists still argue today, because, of course, when you think of these waves, they're not really something that was a historical movement and it passed completely. Many feminists today will be liberal feminists. Many feminists today will be radical feminists. Many feminists today will be, for example, anti-intersectionality feminists. You'll have, for example, famously enough, you'll have J.K. Rowling, who is a feminist, but it's very anti-trans.
Critical feminism, we talked about that.
Yeah, that is the position. Of course, she was crucified in the last years and so on, cancelled many times. No, maybe not enough. Yeah, maybe not enough. It's an okay position, but kind of when you think about it, hers is a feminist position. Hers is a feminist position that is completely blind to other possibilities of discrimination. For example, trans rights. Yeah. No, but I don't know. What's my favorite one of these? I can upload you that link. She's a very, very good theorist. I don't know the lady. She lost actually her job somewhere in England for this thing. But I will send you at one point. She is very good at articulating. She makes a convincing argument that's kind of there is a large point of incompatibility between some gender policies and some feminist policies, which is actually a very interesting point to make when you argue about it policy-wise. For example, in Great Britain, you had this entire policy in which male and female detention was distinguished based on your identification. Now, if you identify in a certain way and based on your identification, you get sent to an adequate prison, a male prison or a female prison, you're like, okay, you identify as such. But it's a prison in there. A lot of not nice things happen in prisons. And it actually was the case in Great Britain that this started causing quite a lot of problems in terms of daily functioning of prisons. Because you had biological men in female prisons and the other way around. Now, in some of these situations, you had instances of rape. So at the policy level, identification doesn't always work in the sense that you can say it always leads to good consequences. When, for example, identification becomes, it's fine, it's a criteria for your for your identity card. It's fine. whatever, usage of toilet, but when you reach some situations in which there is possibilities of, for example, rape, of abuse, similar things become or can become more complicated. Anyhow, I'm going to upload this paper, but she's a philosopher. She's not J.K. Rowling shouting on Twitter. She usually makes very cogent arguments, and she's very nice to kind of have a discussion with and raises some points that are kind of very, very interesting points. I forgot the lady's name completely. S something. Okay, it's fine. Okay. Now, as I told you, usually what is strongly connected with a certain strand of feminist jurisprudence are also certain modes of action. Because in these critical legal theories, we are never content with just theorizing about stuff. You usually have a follow-up, and the follow-up is, how do we make this thing happen? And liberal feminism is pretty mild in this sense. It's usually very mild. The main belief behind this is that reasoned dialogue within the existing institutions, reasoned debate can lead us to change to better understand issues of gender, and eventually will lead to legislative change, leading to recognition of rights, equality of opportunity, and so on and so on. So liberal feminists advocate basically for incremental changes. The idea is, okay, we'll go this year with equality of pay, then we'll advocate for something else, then we'll argue in front of the court, the European court.
Like the slow process.
Yeah, it's basically a slow process, and it's not revolutionary. It's kind of within the existing institutions. If we do a good enough job, we will be able to enact some changes, to make some changes that would render women equal. Now, this was let us see how this works. Now, what Lydia Poet did after this refusal to be enrolled in the bar association, or after court dismissed her appeal, the Court of Cassation, by stating that women are not allowed to exercise the legal profession, she moved in 1819 to the Fourth International Penitentiary Congress. She was a delegate and became a secretary of the International Penitentiary Congress, connected to, how do we call it in Serbian? To detentions, incarcerations, and so on and so on. She represented Italy in various parts of the world as the vice president of the law section of this Congress. The French government appointed her as an officer at the Académie and officially invited her to Paris, and she met all the fantastic lawyers who were doing practicing and theorizing law at the time. In fact, in France, if she was French, she could exercise at the time the legal profession, but not in Italy. At the First World War outbreak, she was working as a Red Cross nurse, earned a silver medal in the work. So she was, in all aspects, an absolutely exceptional woman. In 1920, in mind, this is 37 years after the trial ended in Italy, she obtained, at 65, she obtained the registration thanks to a 1919 law called the Sacchi law that opened all professional careers except the judiciary to women. So even in 1990, she could become a trial lawyer, but she couldn't become a judge. Yeah. 2 years later, in 23, she became the president of the Women's Pro-Voting Committee, founded in Turin 15 years before that, and she died of old age in 94 in Diano Marina in 49. So eventually, she was inscribed in the Bar Association, but at the age of 64, she couldn't make much use of it. Now, how to become a trial lawyer if you're a woman and a liberal feminist. you do all the things that you were mentioning. You argue for a change in law to include an explicit rule allowing women to exercise the legal profession. You wait 40 years, then congrats, you became a trial lawyer. And it's kind of very obvious what the problems with liberal feminism are. If you're like wound to think about future generation, of course, let's have this fight so our daughters will enjoy the rights that we didn't have. But in all honesty, I'm not that patient by myself. I don't know about you. And the problem is that achieving legal reforms in Italy, for example, in the 19th century was very difficult. The difficulty arose not only from the fact that there wasn't people to argue. In fact, you'll see the fantastic arguments from the men who were doing the profession in favor of women, and completely squalid arguments from the opponents of women. It was like, how are you going to appear in the court by wearing a dress? What if she sees a corpse? So on and so on. And now if you have a conversation about the same stuff with somebody with like elementary or middle school in Serbia, you'll get the same arguments in 2025. It won't be much different. But it's very interesting to see these things. So the idea was basically that kind of the problematic thing at that time is there was nobody to listen in the parliament. There was nobody to listen in the courts, like 9 white old men deciding your case. They're influenced by the opinions of other men who write about it. They might be influenced by the opinions of a few women. But of course, the public is in its entirety basically opposed to this. Now, in the parliament, you don't have anybody to vote for your cause. In the court, you don't have anybody to basically enact a decision that might help your cause. So you're kind of fated to argue in public. And when arguing in public, your voice might reach somebody, as you can see in this case, despite the fact that she enrolled early, graduated with honors, she was doing a lot of other work, she became very important in legal circles in Europe and Russia of her time, but yeah, she waited for 40 basically years to be enrolled. Now, this all goes to say that liberal feminism basically doesn't guarantee that reform will eventually lead to progress in women's rights. Now, the problematic thing being that some of the measures, especially legal reforms, usually do not address some deeper societal causes on which law is premised or based. So, enter radical feminist jurisprudence. In radical feminist jurisprudence, law is not treated as a tool anymore. It's not a tool of legal reform. We'll use law to better the position of women and so on and so on. No. Law is basically the oppressor. So, from the perspective of radical feminist jurisprudence, law is viewed in this like Marxist critical sense. Just the glasses are not class glasses, the glasses are gender or sex relation glasses. So, the radical feminist idea is that something that basically institutionalizes the power relations between men and women. Law institutionalizes the existing power relations. It institutionalizes them basically by making women subject to men, and something that institutionalizes these relations cannot help us much in reforming these relations. So if we want to reform law, and if we want to discuss law, what we do is we basically look for signs of discrimination, and look thoroughly for signs of discrimination, signs of reinforcing the power relations that are already existent in a society, And we try to change these issues that are that institutionalize, these legal issues that institutionalize these power relations. In other words, radical legal feminism basically claims we should be a bit more revolutionary when it comes to changing the positions, in the sense that we cannot only focus on reform, we also have to focus on changing the underlying social relations and power relations that exist in each society. And we'll talk about the basic concepts, but the main idea and the main insight is that the legal system is patriarchal. Mm-hmm. The entirety of legal system is there to establish men's dominion over women. And you can apply it, of course, when you see other branches of critical. It's like when you claim that the entirety of the legal system is there to establish dominance of the bourgeoisie over the working class, or the entirety of the legal system is established to, or the law is established to maintain the dominance of the white race over all other races, and so on and so on. Now, the only way to change it is by destroying the patriarchy, basically. So, a modest goal for radical legal feminists, and to change the traditional legal rules. So you saw our key ideas or concepts is the concept of reform, equality of opportunity, and this set of ideas is changed by radical feminism. Now, patriarchy is the main idea, and I'm sure that Dragica explored the concept of patriarchy at length, and she'll do more about it, so I'm not going to dwell now on it. And when Miodrag does his lessons, you'll probably be, or if he doesn't do it, I'll do it. But you'll be able to see how in certain legal concepts you can clearly see the concept of patriarchy. In other legal concepts, not so much, to tell you the truth. I actually think that, as an idea in certain domains, radical feminism is, of course, okay in the sense that liberal feminism actually has these drawbacks that we talked about, and you can see it clearly in the Lydia Poet's case. But in other areas, there are definitely some areas of law that are completely gender neutral.
Blind.
Yeah, like all coordination activities, for example. But if you have a rule that tells you ride on the right side of the street, there's nothing gender relevant in that, or the red light means stop. So it's basically, when you claim that the entirety of law, that's, for me at least, not analytical enough. Mm-hmm. Okay, it's fine to wave a sign on the street, but when you argue seriously about it, I think that one has to affront the fact that there are some parts of the law that are actually neutral.
But okay, we can use that, and I can agree at some point, but the red light, most of the time you have a red man or a green man. So, you have a gender neutral, let's say, norm as a norm of technical aspect, but still the practical creation of that norm is mainly in a man way.
No, I'm absolutely with you. There is this, and I think that's the main contribution of radical feminism. I actually think it's very valuable from the theoretical perspective. It's just the fact is, and it usually is like that, and you'll notice this in writings, for example, even in 2010s, you still have criticisms that feminism was focused too much on criminal law, for example. Mm-hmm. So most of feminism, and you'll discuss this in Dragica, took certain aspects of law. For example, family law, a lot of reasons to kind of have a feminist critique of family law, or inheritance law. Insanely important to criticize from that aspect. Insanely important to criticize it from a radical feminist aspect, especially in Serbia, for example, because in terms of legal acts, women are completely equal. In terms of inheritance, women don't inherit, basically. Yeah. Like in 70% of the cases, they actually renounce the inheritance in favor of the brother of the man in the family, which is catastrophic completely. But I have a good point with Lydia Poet case also.
Is that a problem with the legal system, or is that the problem with the society norms? Because there was that campaign, "What's my part?" What's her part, or something like that, for the women who renounced inheritance. But I think that they did that because of the society norms, not because of the legal norms. Because the society is telling her, "You don't need it. You're married. Give it to your brother. He needs it more."
Let's see how that pans out when we leave it to society, because this radical feminism has some problems related to also this thing, and it's related to the legal profession in Italy. So, and we'll discuss it when we come to that part of the presentation. Now, we discussed a bit patriarchy. For the girls, guys online, please feel free to unmute yourself and just have conversations with us. We hear you pretty well. Hopefully you hear us, and don't kind of, I don't know if you see the entirety of the room. I think I switched on me. Yeah, but you can like see, you can see the girls. You can see the girls.
Yes, we can see them now.
Yeah. Finally. Who wants to see me while I'm doing what? Yeah. Here are the girls. They usually see you probably in that room.
No, they don't.
You see them finally now. It's much more cozy to have it here. This is the Center for Legal Fundamentals. Hopefully, we'll meet each other at least by the end of semester, at least once in these rooms. They weren't thinking about this room. They think it's mine. I don't really consider it mine. But yeah, it's like they could have done it here. It's much nicer than in the room 9. But yeah, especially since the lectures are at 6 and nobody's basically using it at 6. So I'm going to suggest Ivana and Dragica to move it here.
Yeah, it's much more comfy.
Yeah, but the only problem, I think they will call me if they have technical problems, which I would go crazy.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, because when they do things here, they call me for technical problems, not Petar. If I make them call Petar, then I'm going to call them to do it here. Now...
And we do have technical problems very often.
Really?
Yeah.
At least once every class.
No, now WebEx is fixed. That's good news. So you don't have the 45 minutes. Yeah, there isn't a subscription. They fixed that definitely. I hate that room upstairs. It's kind of doesn't work for me.
White.
Yeah, it's something. There's something white, and this is like an apartmenty thing, which I kind of enjoy. Yeah, there are tables. No, it was built with the European project that we are finishing in a couple of months. So I basically chose everything that you see in the room. I renovated it completely. It was the old apartment when the housekeeper of the faculty, the former housekeepers had been living on the faculty for like 60 years, 70 years since the faculty was founded, and they stopped that. And when the last housekeeper went to his pension, retirement, and I just got this project, so I asked them, would you give me this room? And they told me, yeah, if you renovate it, and I just renovated everything. Nice. So it's kind of nice. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it actually here. Now, we talked a bit about patriarchy. So the idea of these radical feminist movements is that it doesn't have to be that even traffic lights are based on like discrimination. It can be kind of, let's put on our glasses, or let's attune our analysis of legal solutions on the idea that every legal rule, every legal act might contain some kind of patriarchal bias. And there's many reasons to suppose so. It's usually made by men. We usually use some traditional solutions. Some of the legal solutions have been in force for 50 years. Legal systems are huge. You have these residues from the 70s, 80s, 90s, so on. For Serbia, that isn't. Our legal system is basically a residue from socialist law. And in 45, and ex-Yugoslavia, women had the rights, the amount of rights that women gained at the moment that the war finished was practically unfathomable to all the other European women. It was insane. Now the social relations were different, and they kept their pace for quite a long time. But for example, if you know that women got voting rights in 45 in ex-Yugoslavia and in Serbia, and that the last canton in Switzerland they got not even in it was the last canton in Switzerland. It was 1990, I think. Switzerland as a whole. I don't even know. It's not Graubünden. It's a German canton because the cantons are sovereign and they have direct democracy. Basically, they were voting for whether women should have voting rights. Like 5 years ago, they were voting whether one should be able to build a mosque in Switzerland, and they can't vote no. You can't build a mosque, which is senseless. Like the perils of direct democracy. Yes, it's like that. But I think that this canton, check it out, maybe I'm making a mistake, in 1991 canton, it's not a huge canton part of Switzerland, but yeah, still had the prohibition of voting rights for women. Now, what is brought to prominence with radical feminism is also sexism as a system of oppression. Now, the idea is that women are not only oppressed by preferential treatment of men in law, but also with all these manifestations of patriarchy. And manifestations of patriarchy are usually sexism. Now, legal solutions maintain this male power. The male power is usually not derived from legal solutions, but from societal relations of power. But legal acts and legal norms basically maintain these relations. Now, what is also done in radical feminism, or at least feminist jurisprudence, is that more accent is put on the deconstructing traditional gender roles. In liberal feminism, this is not usually done. Now, when you consider, okay, just give me the opportunity to become a trial lawyer, here you go, here's the opportunity to become a trial lawyer. For a liberal feminist proper, that's fine. But if you have 9 kids and become a trial lawyer,
but that's not
in
the
a
opportunity. That's still not the quite the opportunity.
Yeah, that's still not the equality, but we usually kind of call it equality of legal opportunity, and kind of this, you could call it equality of social opportunity. So the idea is kind of, even if you give the same right, you end up in quite different positions because the societal situation is such that there are some power relations even without law. So the gender roles in radical feminism are rightfully emphasized because if you don't have the means to exercise a right that's legally given to you because of societal power relations, you don't really need the right. If you don't have to give it to me if I can't exercise it actively. Now, some ideas also focus on women experiences. This is sometimes discussed in the strand that we call difference feminism, but I muffle it all together within this strand, radical feminism. The idea on this emphasis, which has become especially important in intersectionality, is that kind of we should also take into account the individuality of lived experiences. This is a thing that we will have to discuss because law, at least, is very inept to keep in mind this thing like individual experiences. Law is a coarse tool for regulating social life. Basically, if you want to achieve a minimum of justice, you have to equalize somewhere. And it's not just in the relations between men and women, for example, it's in various other relations. We could, for example, say when we give voting rights at 18, we could say there are people who are mature enough to vote at 16, not 16. Or there are people who are immature enough to vote at 21. Why not move them at 21? But law, in order to standardize and to make social regulation by law possible, you have to draw a line somewhere, and that line is kind of usually leaves out something, includes something, and so on and so on. But the idea is that, at least in principle, the radical feminism focuses on these women experiences. What becomes important as a topic, and this is a strong bias in radical feminism towards especially criminal law, is this idea of male violence, of gender-based violence. Now, all the concepts that are okay, in Serbia, nothing more is popular, just political change. But usually when we discuss other things, we have these huge discussions about how should we regulate. Does it make sense to speak about femicide? And how should we regulate femicide? So you should, there's my colleagues who are very skeptical, as you encounter people who are very skeptical of this. What's the opposite of femicide? It's kind of, but how do you call it when you kill a man? And I'm like, homicide. It's implied in the term. You just call it in a similar way. But for example, that discussion is derived from these early discussions, and this is 70s, 80s, basically these discussions. And the idea is this becomes a huge problem in intersectionality. The idea is basically that in criminal law we should focus on male violence. And there is a lot of incidences of male violence just for the sheer fact that men grow stronger. And that's kind of the natural thing. It isn't implied that when you grow stronger, you can be the hell out of other persons who are not as strong as you, of course, in any other relations. But given the close relations, usually in heterosexual relationships, you had a lot of this. There is that weird kind of, from I think that this, I'm going to post it for you on Moodle. Do you know that Slavoj Žižek joke on the bridge when he says, this is the bridge in Ljubljana that very important. It's beautiful here in summer, but it's not summer, it's winter. And the bridge in winter is important because it is the exact line where Eastern Europe is delimited from Western Europe. And how do we distinguish why the line is important? Because in Eastern Europe, like, women get beaten and like it. In Western Europe, women get beaten and don't like it. And it's kind of, yeah, in the 90s, it's a very heavy joke. Of course, it's a very conscious joke of the fact that kind of in the 90s, you basically only had the start of something that you now have as proper regulation of family violence. Now, in the West, especially after the fall of the Berlin Wall, there was kind of this idea, you call the police intervenes, in Scandinavian countries especially, but in the East, you know this, I mean, at least my generation remembers it. You didn't have this idea. But it was basically a don't ask, don't tell. And the opportunity, basically, if it's horrendous. There was nothing like and that is also an important point of radical feminism. It is this entire idea of the private, kind of what is public and what is private. And male-female relations within a relationship were private. And even if you call...
Yeah, but I think it's because of the trust in institutions. I think that in these Eastern countries, we don't have that trust into an institution, because when you call the police, then you get investigated by some male policeman who treats you even worse. So you lose the trust, and then.
But actually, this is it's not by chance that of course Žižek is from Slovenia, so he was there. He was even teaching. He was on the institute working in the 90s. But it's not by chance, because Slovenia is kind of this. I mean, metaphorically, you could even speak. Yeah, it was very split. Maybe in Slovenia even earlier than that, but definitely in the 90s, you could basically do such a thing. There was more Western-like consciousness of like the possibility of calling the police, the institutional support. But when you slide like further to the east, there was way less of that. And even in ex-Yugoslavia, you had huge differences within countries, especially for example, we were talking about inheritance. We'll probably talk more about it. But if you check in Belgrade, you won't have so many incidences of women saying, no, my brother should inherit everything, like maybe in Vranje. In Vranje, probably it's like 70% of women denouncing their inheritance in favor of a brother. In Belgrade, you'll have way less of that. So it's kind of a matter of degrees. Some problems are acute in some parts, and nobody does anything about it. That's at least the crux of Zizek's cruel joke. And there is like the same situation, but institutions don't do anything about it in a certain part. Of course, it's a generalization, but for example, probably you had less incidents of this in Zagreb. Probably you had less incidents of this in Belgrade, or you had maybe in Skopje, maybe in Sarajevo, you had less incidents of this. But when you move towards the periphery of a country or the big country, you had more incidents of this, as it usually happens. And finally, we have this reproductive rights and bodily autonomy. It coincides with the invention of the pill, basically. So women's autonomy is a very concrete thing. It's connected to the possibility of deciding what to do with your own body. Because until the pill, you weren't able to decide what to do with your own body, and especially bodily autonomy, in the sense that you're the owner of your body, and the idea of reproduction is not the idea of reproduction that existed before the possibility to decide, to choose on these issues. So these are the key ideas of radical feminism. Now, with these key ideas, you have different modes of action. We should radically transform society. Okay, I'm doing okay. There is a strong idea of direct action, and you have these huge marches, like the Women's Strike for Equality in the 70s, the Women's March in 2017. Most of these movements are connected to the United States of America. And you know, most of these movements are really connected to the United States of America. It was the Wild West when the suffragettes were moving through that. Basically, it was still the old United States in which people were shooting guns, kicking them when they were coming to...
But did suffragettes started in UK or in USA?
There was a strong movement in the US in the after the Civil War. After the Civil War in the 60s. So the last four, but did it start?
I thought that it started in UK.
As an idea, yeah. As an idea, yeah. Because the biggest theories of women's rights to vote were basically at the end of the 19th century, a couple of theorists, Mary Wollstonecraft. There was also the person who wrote that, the Declaration of Rights at the time of the French Revolution, the Declaration of Rights of Women, when the Declaration of Rights of Men was adopted. It was written in 1790 or something like that.
93.
Yeah, 93. And it's kind of a huge deal, but it was two persons, basically. Then after that, you have kind of John Stuart Mill, who was writing about it on utilitarian grounds, and that's kind of the middle of the 19th century. He was a feminist at the time, and he was arguing for that. But I think most of the movements, at least concrete modes of action in terms of marches, in terms of kind of making rallies and so on, that's the United States. For various reasons, one of the main reasons was that the United States was very local as a country, was always very, still is from time to time. For example, they gathered around, they made a lot of civil society associations, just naturally. They always had a sense of kind of making smaller communities that might enact certain change and so on.
That's kind of natural because they came from the different, so they have that ethnic gathering.
Yeah.
Like
there is a good book written 10 years ago. It's called Bowling Alone. It's by a sociologist. Can't remember names tonight. Sorry. You can always check GPT or Google it. But it's It's a very important book about the erosion of these smaller communities in the United States of America, and how basically it erodes civic activism and so on and so on. That was very strong in the United States of America. I don't know if this erosion was, but it could be, or maybe they moved a lot of it into the digital space. I'm not really sure, but that is a very strong thing in the United States. I mean, in Serbia, it's just different traditions. When you gather with 5 people, basically the police arrests you for activities against the state, or something is suspicious. They look at you suspiciously. What are you doing with other persons? In the United States, it's usually very welcome to make these civil societies. Now, most modes of actions that we talk about today are in debt to radical feminism. For example, an emphasis on linguistic modes of changing linguistic practices in languages which allow for different linguistic practices. That's a radical feminist idea. Changing legal education and training, establishing feminist legal services. And you can notice from this slide, and I won't go into detail about many of these because we'll have a chance to discuss them. Most of them are not focused on direct influence, legal influence on social affairs. They basically take these kind of background social relations as something that should be changed in order for legal change to make sense. Okay, now let's see how this pans out how Lydia Poet pans out when we take into account these radical feminist positions. In 1919, the law was changed to allow women to become trial lawyers in Italy. In 1980, so 7 decades after Lydia Poet was admitted to the chambers, in Italy, there was no more than 10% of trial lawyers that were female. So for 70 years since allowing allowing this change or reforming this thing, there was basically none. The results were 0 in terms of women participating. And you can imagine in the 70s somebody writing a book about the legal profession claiming that, okay, we allowed it, but obviously women do not want to do the legal profession because they're not interested in the legal profession. This is a natural effect of life that women do not do law. They do not want to, even when they have the opportunity. A noticeable increase was only observed after the introduction of maternity benefits in 1990 in Italy. And today, the result of maternity benefits and other changes was that there are more male than female trial lawyers in Italy. A maternity benefit and the changes that happened in the 80s and the 90s were actually not legal changes. There was a strong social emancipation of women in Italy since the 80s that you didn't have in the previous 17 years. When you're a woman and a radical feminist, the recipe for becoming a trial lawyer: finish a faculty of law, inscribe at the Bar Association, change existing laws, change the legal system, change more laws, fight vigorously for 110 years, and congrats, most women are in. So it's kind of and I just put this picture because we ended up in a similar thing. The fact that we gave voting rights to women doesn't mean that women actually voted. In fact, there was not much voting in ex-Yugoslavia at all, truth be told. But even in those situations, it's like not that the women were running to vote in all the situation. Now, let's see some of the problems with radical feminism. Of course, even if this radical form, I'm not giving you the right-wing conservative criticism. So feminism, of course, you know all these because people shout them all the time. But even if you take it from a feminist perspective, there is some problems. Now, first, the first is the problem of some essentialist views on sex. I mislabeled it here on gender. Mostly radical feminism focused on this binary distinction. So it's basically male, female, that's it. And it's male, female positions and so on. Now,
It's focused on sex, not on
yeah. Now, the patriarchy was blamed for everything. And when you kind of establish patriarchy as the sole source of women's suppression, you leave out many other things. One thing that you leave out, for example, is class. Kind of being poor is worse than being a poor woman is worse than being a woman. So the economic situations, and it's that Marxist trend of feminism that I won't be discussing in detail in this situation, because it's connected also to this change, to this idea of intersectionality. And finally, what grew clear in the 90s and in the 2000s is that even radical feminism was completely blind to the slew of problems that women of, for example, color, LGBTQ plus individuals, and those individuals from different social classes, the problems that they exhibit in certain social situations, in fact, in most social situations. And all these criticisms are kind of valid, even if our default position today is like Dragica's basically position. Let's kind of include everything. Dragica is very happy about intersectionality for good reasons. So we come basically to our final, or the position that's pretty much the norm nowadays, and it became the norm in the last, it isn't 35 years, it has to be 20 years. I mean, yes, this article was written in the late 90s by Kimberly, I can't pronounce her surname. Was Chainshaw? Yeah, I think so. Okay. The main idea is to remedy all the problems that we had with the myopies of even radical feminism. Now, the idea in jurisprudence is to take into account various interconnected modes of discrimination that can exist in contemporary society, in contemporary law, and especially in jurisprudence from the perspective of the legal system. Now, the main idea is to emphasize the experiences not only of white women, or white rich women, but to emphasize the experience of marginalized women. And marginalization in the 90s and 2000s especially isn't primarily derived from the fact that somebody is of a different sex. It's derived from the fact that somebody is of a different gender. It's derived still from the fact that you have a combination of race and gender. It's derived from the fact that you have a combination of a personal characteristic, like a situation of any kind of invalidity, of impossibility to do certain things, combined with some of these situations, and so on and so on. Now, the main idea is to individualize. And in fact, individuals can face unique challenges because they are in certain unique positions. So these are also the key ideas. Now, we do not focus, or at least when you're in an intersectional feminist, or when you try to do intersectional feminist jurisprudence, of course you focus still on women's issues, but you tend to focus on those issues that combine discrimination, legal discrimination against and social discrimination against women, combined with discrimination based on class, especially poverty, because usually in the West people don't talk about class. They
are rich.
They're either rich or poor, and they talk about poverty. They're fine talking about poverty, but not talking about class. Now it's like the Western idea is all this, if you work, you won't be poor, but that's not actually true. Yeah. There's plenty of situations where you work and you're still poor, insanely poor, and you can't afford basically anything. I mean, even if you take into account New York, for example, you have the Mamdani guy who basically won the election by repeating the word affordability, which basically means that nobody can afford to rent, let alone to own a house in New York. So it's absolutely settled. If you can win an election in New York just by shouting basically affordability, that gives you an idea of the situation that New Yorkers are in. I mean, in our cases, if you can't afford a flat to pay in Serbia, call that kind of very close to poverty. What else? You live with your parents, eventually your parents have something. I mean, our modes of family life and social support are stronger than the American modes, so you can always, or you can usually 90% of the cases, you'll find a family member who'll have you. That's kind of the situation. Many more people, when you have these connections detached, many more people end up on the street and so on and so on. So at least that part is definitely problematic, and the intersectionalist perspective basically combines these issues, inclusivity and diversity. Dragica will talk about this. She loves talking about this, and and it's mostly political, to tell you the truth. I mean, the idea of inclusivity and diversity is limited by this mode of, and we'll talk about this, by the mode in which law regulates things. Now, you noticed in the Lydia Poet case, in this last iteration, and I told you that we are going to talk about this, you can change stuff legally. For example, in the inheritance thing. And you say, for example, okay, women and men have the equal rights to inherit. But socially, it doesn't work. So it's social rules. Now, let's try to amend the social rules by introducing a legal rule, because that's possible. Now, we would have to kind of prohibit women from renouncing inheritance. But even if we prohibit women from renouncing inheritance, it raises the problem of prohibiting everybody to renounce inheritance, because law is usually kind of either you don't have really the moral grounds to prohibit women renouncing inheritance. Like, I want to renounce my inheritance. It's the autonomy of will. You can always argue that it's a choice. And you have to be very paternalistic to say, oh, this is justified. For example, I wouldn't say it's justified, even if one could claim that it advances female rights eventually down the line. But it's highly problematic from a moral perspective. My basic idea also, law is not the right tool for certain things. And for example, you have this as a modality always, and a lot of literature since the 2000s has been written about this. It's called nudges. So it's not law, it's a nudge. And nudge is an idea, for example, some still think it's paternalistic. Nudge is the idea to set up social situations to be such that you encourage or discourage certain modes of behavior.
What's nudge in Serbian?
Nudge doesn't have a good translation in Serbian. Pogurate neko ka nečem. Znači nije da ti, I'm not prohibiting you from doing something, I'm not kind of giving you a right to do something or forcing you to do something. I just kind of nudge you to do something. Okay. I push you towards doing a thing that's eventually in your favor. Now, it's a bit paternalistic in this sense, but you have these nudges in various forms, and they're a very interesting form of social regulation. Sometimes they're used for certain things that are not kind of fantastic. For example, I can give you an interesting example. When you go in Germany to Buchenwald, it's a concentration camp, and you go to the concentration camp and you kind of visit the concentration camp to see what the experiences were. Now, when you come into the concentration camp, the moment that you come in, you have a set of places that you have to go through in order to advance to the next place. So you're not free to move around. And you come first inside the room where they show you the liberation of Buchenwald by the Allied forces. You see a movie. It's a very difficult movie to watch. One problem with Buchenwald is that they were, when they went to Weimar, the Allied forces, and asked the inhabitants of Weimar what was happening, asked them, did you know what was happening in Buchenwald? None of them said yes. Mm-hmm. Everybody said no. So they took everybody to the camp, mm-hmm. and they walked everybody through the camp. And they were vomiting and so on and so on. I mean, of course, they knew, kind of knew. It's just disregarded it completely for this reason or another. Now, the camp doesn't allow you to move freely, and you have all these steps. It's very troublesome. So at the moment you come into the museum, you're fed up. You can't stand it emotionally anymore because it's very difficult. And you're like, finally, they leave you and they tell you, okay, you can now visit the museum, and you hope that you will kind of pass the museum, go out because you don't want to see anything anymore. But the museum goes like this. You come on the right, and there is the long corridor to the left, right, straight to the right. So you can't skip. Mm-hmm. You can't skip. You can't go forward. And you're basically forced to walk the entire thing, basically. It kind of seems like a form of torture. Of course, it isn't. You can skip eventually or go through these steps quicker. But still, it kind of nudges you to look, to see this, to see that, to see the uniform, to see this situation, to see a picture, to see. And it really stays with you. There's now nobody's forcing you to look at all those things, but kind of you're nudged to consider them seriously. And in social situations, you can also do that. For example, you could set up some policies. Let's say this same situation with the inheritance. Let's say that when you renounce inheritance, you pay a tax. But when you don't renounce your inheritance, you don't have to pay anything to the state. Yeah. It's not a direct form of control, social control. You're just nudging somebody. It doesn't have to be high, but still you're giving some money. If you do this thing, that's kind of, we know that it's a practice that's kind of a chauvinist practice based on patriarchy. And you're kind of trying to nudge. And maybe in some of these situations, this brother or this patriarchal family will say, for example, maybe like, it's better not to pay this, let's leave this property with you or something like that. So that is kind of a way of regulating things that's not directly prohibiting or giving a right, but it's kind of basically nudging somebody in a direction that eventually also is good for them. That's kind of the idea. Now, our legal system is very coarse for that because of the Serbian state. I don't know where everybody else is from, but yeah. And these modalities of regulation have been seriously considered in various issues. Of course, nudges can also be deeply anti a category of, for example, one of the terrible, most famous nudges at train stations, they remove benches or they construct benches to make them like this. So you can just lean on the bench.
Yeah, they also put
that is basically, you're not prohibiting anybody, and you're just, of course, there. Yes. Eventually, it boils down to the purpose, and can you justify the purpose of your regulation? It's especially problematic when you don't have a building for the homeless, and you don't allow the homeless to sleep there. Okay, it's fine. I have some homeless shelters, I have places that can move you, there is a social service that can move you, but when you just disallow somebody and you don't have any facilities to do it, that is problematic. Or
in Berlin last week, and a friend told me that because they have metro stations and they lock them up by night. Yeah. So when it's winter, they unlock them for the homeless people so they can go in and sleep and not freeze, because Berlin is freezing when it's winter. So it's like a policy, which is...
In 2008, the Hauptbahnhof in Zurich was full. When I came to, it was I was writing my magisterial thesis, and it was full of homeless people, mainly junkies. It was an entire... so they decided by popular vote to build a building next to the Hauptbahnhof. In the building, they employed medical nurses and medical doctors. And the building wasn't a medical institution proper. So basically, everybody was in it. It was completely revolutionary for me. Mine, 2008, I think, is the year. You could get clean needles. I was stunned. So basically, you could go sleep, get clean needles, and you can pass the time there. After 10 days, nobody else was. There was the park near the Hauptbahnhof was completely clean. Nobody was sleeping there anymore. You had a lower incidence. It wasn't prohibited to sleep in the park. It wasn't obligatory to go to the building. They just moved. Because if you have a building where you get a clean needle and like you have doctors, but if something happens, I mean, you didn't solve the individual problem, somebody being a junkie, but you solved many other problems and you kind of protected his life. And it to me, nudge wasn't a big thing at that point. Nudge, especially in politics, became like very important with Obama's administration because there's this Harvard theorist who theorized a lot about nudges. Cass Sunstein, he's called. I'm starting to remember the name. Cass Sunstein he's called, and he wrote this book, Nudge, with some psychologists. He does also behavioral psychology, defends this concept of nudges for various situations. And this was my first encounter with something of a nudge. So, and it always looked to me like kind of, but lawyers like are that guy that only has a hammer and everything looks like a nail. Let's prohibit it. Let's criminalize this behavior and so on. But you see, it's much more efficient sometimes if you just try to solve those problems that are there in front of you by nudging people to use the opportunities that they already have and not by kind of making it obligatory, making it prohibited, which are the legal tools of doing this. Anyhow, and finally, the third thing that we have with intersectionalist feminist jurisprudence, and we didn't have in radical feminism, is that this rejection of essentialism. So they, and you know this because you discussed this, male and female become much more fluid concepts because various trans issues, various identities become a topic of discussion, especially since Judith Butler's theoretization of this gender and sex differences that makes a lot of sense depending on the form it takes. Traditional legal frameworks are critiqued and now the emphasis is on legal reform, social reform, and reforming of institutions. How am I doing? Not bad. Using too much time, I'm like Dragica. What page is this? Wait a second.
Will we have a break?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm talking for an hour and a half now. You can always have a break. Just tell me.
I want one.
No, it's fine. Absolutely. We can make a pause if everybody's fine. I've been...
That's for sharing.
Okay. Okay. The students in the room say that they are tired.
No, we need to smoke.
Do you vape or smoke? Yeah, okay. We make.
We were also tired.
I didn't understand.
রাজু ম্যাম
Ne razumem.
Ne razumem. Okay, we'll make a short break,
okay.
5-minute break,
Okay.
and we come back. Okay. Was.
মোটামুটি রেডি দিতেছে আর কি এই হ্যাঁ ভাইয়া ইংলিশ খুবই হালকা পাতলা এই দেশে ভাষা আলাদা আর ইংলিশ কম জান তো ভাষা আছে যেমন আপনি হচ্ছে গিয়া কাকুসি মানে আপনি কেমন আছেন তারপর মানে হ্যালো হ্যালো অথবা চাও চাও এরকম ভাষা আছে ভাইয়া নিজস্ব
বসেন আমি অফ করে দিই ভিডিও অফ করে দিই বসেন এখন বসেন
এই অবস্থা ভাইয়া কি করবে ভাইয়া জাহাঙ্গীর ভাই ঠিক আছে অনেক শুক্রিয়া আদায় করতে হবে ঠিক আছে চেষ্টা করেন দেখা যাক কি করে হ্যাঁ মানিক পেলে দেখে না মানিক না আচ্ছা ওই যে দেলার বাইকটা একসাথে আছে দেলার বাইকটা ডোমেস্টিক ভিসা এই শহর থেকে এই শহর একসাথে আছে এক শহর তার শহর মানে এই দেশ থেকে আরেক দেশ গেলে এই দেশের মধ্যে এক শহর তার শহর যেমন বাংলাদেশ থেকে ঢাকা থেকে ভাইয়া ঠিক আছে তাহলে পরে ফোন দিবেন ভাই সবাই আছে ওইটা বুঝাই নাকি ফোন দিয়ে ভয়েস দিয়ে রাখেন
ভয়েস হলে আপনি কোথায় আছেন সেটা আর কি লিভিং প্লেস মানে অ্যাড্রেস থাকা অ্যাড্রেস লিভিং অ্যাড্রেস হোয়াইট কার্ড কিছুই না আমাদের দেশে কোনো নিয়ম আছে না বাড়িওয়ালা রিপোর্ট করতে আগে ডিটেল দেওয়া লাগে এদেরটা একটু কাস্টমাইজ করা আর কি ডাটাবেজ রেকর্ড করে আর আমাদের দেশে তো ডাটাবেজ নেই সেম জিনিস কত কষ্ট সেই ডিউটি করে আইসা টানা ক্লাস তারপরে ঘুম তারপরে খাওয়া কত কষ্ট
That's
We finished. We should finish at 8.
okay.
No. I think that I'm not going to look into it. We passed through a lot of these. Now, and you're used to this now, each wave comes, or each strand comes with different modes of action, and intersectionality, you have not so much emphasis on criminal law anymore, like in radical feminism. You have collaboration with other social justice movements. In the United States, you have all the issues related to woke, but we are not going to talk about that in this instance. You have a focus on alternate dispute resolution, for example, because the legal system usually offers these coarse judicial ways of resolving disputes, and intersectional feminists at times focus on these alternative methods of resolving disputes, elaborating on mediations, and how do we call this? Okay, I'm forgetting words again. It's not mediation, it's basically you cannot formulate a coherent set of doctrines. It's always mixed with modes of action, mixed with key points, mixed with key ideas, mixed with liberal feminism criticisms, mixed with radical feminism criticism, and so on and so on. And it's usually quite difficult. But kind of, for me at least, makes it quite interesting. And you have these huge feuds, like this feud that we were mentioning, between somebody who's basically a liberal feminist and somebody who's an intersectionalist. And oftentimes, really, these modes of behavior can be based on solid theoretical grounds, like in the cases that we mentioned, because some of the interests of classical feminist struggle
This meeting is being transcribed.
Especially that one sticking point of collision, at least in public debates, but also in legal regulation, was this point of collision. If you make the differences between genders and sexes so fluid as to, based and completely on personal subjective declaration of belonging to a certain gender, sex, and so on and so on. Some things in law, at least, especially penitentiary law, become objectively problematic and become kind of sticking points for situations in which you have female vulnerability in terms of female sexual vulnerability, for example. So those are things that become kind of hot points for dispute. And for
But
good
it's
reason.
really worth mentioning that it's not that black and white. because it's really not that black and white. It's more of a gray area in all the intersectionality cases. So we can talk a lot about it, but it's really just like these issues are really not that, in a sentence-wise, made.
Well, from the perspective of law, at least, when we talk generally about this, there is a slew of things that, and this is the thing that I tell you when I say law is a course tool. For example, lived experience is one of the topics in radical feminism, is very problematic from the perspective of law. Our idea of legal regulation, and I think the general idea of legal regulation, if you wanted to focus completely on individual cases, you would basically have to default to administrative regulation of individual situations. If you have administrative regulation of individual situation, you practically have unlimited discretion of the administration or of the to be kind of stingy about it, you have basically somewhat of a police kind of discretion in these matters. And you don't really want this in many situations. Usually, you want to be able to regulate social situations with a general rule, because the general rule allows for a minimum of just regulation. It kind of ensures you that my situation is regulated in the same way as the same situation of another person. So it gives kind of, with all the drawbacks, of course, but it gives kind of a sense of justice. If you have this endless individual regulation, you have situations in which an administrative body has to decide on each individual case. And it's very difficult to kind of allow that.
But do you think that that provision on the radical feminist for the lived experiences actually created a path for the intersectionality?
I'm not really sure. Radical feminism was mostly completely blind to intersectional discrimination. Now, the whole point of earlier feminist movements, I don't see intersectionality as something that is kind of, and please don't understand me as claiming this. Dragica would probably claim that this is an evolution of feminism, intersectionality. But that's Dragica's claim. But for example, you have huge icons of feminism in the United States of America that are classical liberal feminists. And you still consider, for example, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the judge of the Supreme Court of the United States. Nobody would tell you that she wasn't a feminist. That her feminist positions are completely liberal feminist positions. Let's equalize men and women in the sense that let's enact law and let's render judicial decisions that actually bring about legal equality of men and women. There was nothing radical about her feminism, for example. So, and she died like 5 years ago. She left the bench. She died from the bench because 10 years in the United States, basically until the end of your life or until you resign. Some of the justices now are not as pronounced feminists, but they're still liberal feminists. And within the mindset of liberal feminism, there's still room to make improvements. Even if in the United States in the 70s or in the 60s you had Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Act that gave voting rights to women, you had all these moves to make. Now in European legal systems where laws are the primary tools of regulating, not judicial precedents like in the United States, but laws are the primary tools of making equalizing men and women, the discussions usually revolve around different issues because at least nominally on the level of legal acts, we're equalized in terms of the opportunity. So our issues are more substantial in a sense. Should we positively discriminate is most of the time our question. Should we have quotas in parliament for women? Should we make women, and that's kind of like, for example, that is the liberal feminist. So if you equalize, and there is a huge difference between the results of these movements in various areas. If you have obligatory military service, should women be included in the obligatory military service? Like 50 years ago in socialism, we didn't consider that to be the case. Today, I don't know. If you had military service, I'm not sure how it would pan out if women would be included or not, and so on and so on. For example, radical feminism would be against usually the claim of liberal feminism that you have absolute equality. You, according to radical feminism, most of the time, according to most theorists, there are situations in which is justified, morally justified, to legally regulate the position of men and women differently for various reasons. One reason might be in terms of military service, whether women are really needed for military service or are not needed for military service, whether maybe kind of even socially speaking and in terms of social interest, whether to make it an option for women, an obligation for men, which is also an option, and so on and so on. So the positions diverge a lot when it comes to concrete legal solutions, both in the United States of America and on the European continent. But I'm not really sure in the sense that that's why I'm not sure in the sense we progressed. Mm-hmm. Of course, when you become aware in intersectionalism that descriptively speaking, black women are worse off than white women. Black poor women are worse off than white women. That's an important descriptive point that can lead to social action. But that doesn't mean that you superseded radical feminism or that you superseded liberal feminism. It's perfectly, at least to me, it is perfectly kind of morally justified to hold liberal feminist views in certain aspects, radical feminist views in other aspects. This becomes especially important when it comes to advocacy. Advocacy is definitely a problematic part. I mean, theoretically speaking, we can discuss all these issues. But in terms of advocacy, or at least I think it's kind of rational to always think in terms which discourse allows me to move social awareness of these issues and to bring about social change the most. Mm-hmm. So if you go to a village in eastern Serbia and speak about intersectionality, I'm not sure how much ground you would cover. Mm-hmm. But if you kind of speak about from the perspective of kind of maybe radical feminist ideas, and if you bring in some traditional values in that, which can transmute actually in some situations in kind of these okay ideas, at least okay ideas, and it's always something to think about. And there's always the habitual matter, in the sense that what I noticed, at least in these discussions, resistance is much higher when it comes to for example, introducing some radical feminist or intersectionalist ideas, then introducing some liberal ideas. But the problematic thing, and this is the thing that I want to kind of finish on, the point with radical feminism and intersectional feminism is that they don't focus much on legal reform. They usually focus on other means.
So I wanted to ask you, is it possible in any way to put that intersectionality into the laws? Because we mentioned that the law is generalizing in some way in finding that middle. How to put intersectionality into the law?
This is at least my kind of opinion on this idea. So just like with the idea of patriarchy and radical feminism, intersectionality is also the regulative idea. So basically putting on your intersectional glasses in the sense that you consider law as a tool that's making some social changes or institutionalizing certain things. And then you try to analyze the law from this perspective. So you basically, in radical feminism, you would ask yourself, is this perpetuating relations of power related to men and women? In intersectional ideas, is this perpetuating the worse off position of certain categories. Okay, for example, you can ask yourself that for women, you can ask a separate question for women with disabilities, you can ask a separate question for racial women. We usually, in Serbia, for example, we speak kind of like, we don't have racial issues, or we in fact have a lot of racial issues. Our racial issues with the Roma population are huge. It's just the fact that the cultural matrices of the Roma population are basically inaccessible to us. It's very difficult to make direct legal interventions in the Roma population. And kind of you have a perpetuation of social stereotypes and these institutional stereotypes in terms of Roma population. But the situation is terrible. And it's not addressed in any way, shape, or form. Just imagine, we always use these examples because we don't have much concrete empirical data on this population, especially in relation, for example, I think somebody on the Faculty of Law is doing in intersectionality in labor law. Mina Kuzminac, an assistant on the Faculty of Law, she's doing that for her PhD. I think that will be the first empirical data that we have in Serbia that is related to a branch of law related to some intersectional issues. I would tell you about this stuff. The data is basically non-existent. I can tell you more about the treatment of kind of black women in the United States of America from certain neighborhoods in New York City, like in very precise terms, than about the Roma population that lives in certain parts of Belgrade. It's kind of this thing, especially when you have a lot of political turmoil, nobody discusses these things. And you can, of course, easily imagine, for example, in Serbia, you can look around you to see how accessible are buildings, government buildings. And then intersectionality problems become obvious when you have a situation when you have a blind female person with 2 kids that has to access the government building. Come on, it's basically impossible. I mean, it's very difficult to imagine how the persons with disabilities in Belgrade do not use public means of transportation. Public means of transportation have a place, but you cannot climb in it. It's difficult to climb in it if you're without disabilities, let alone in this situation. So it's very kind of, the theoretical classes are great. At least I think them great. But it's just a matter that kind of, like when you're at a certain level, it's very difficult to introduce the level of groundbreaking ideas that intersectionality sometimes entails. And I think, at least in the last 13 years, we can agree on this. Most of the time, Serbian society has been desensitized even to these issues that previously were some issues that we were at least a bit sensitive to. And for example, Montenegrin society is weirdly more sensitive towards these issues than the Serbian society. And this was basically done not by legislation, but by promotion and association of persons, for example, with disabilities, or persons with kind of some intersectionalist discrimination issues in associations, and the promotion of these issues in various situations, and especially in public. At least when these issues are visible, and they're completely invisible in Serbia. I mean, I don't watch a lot of television, but it's been ages since I've seen a TV documentary about problems of, for example, disabled persons in...
Yesterday, I organized a roundtable between the media and civil society organizations who represent marginalized groups, and we were discussing this. You have either bad and harmful reporting, or you have nothing, like total blindness. So it's...
And it doesn't get through these days, especially in the last years, because the political polarization is through the roof, and there's just one topic in Serbia. All the other topics are aside. When we solve this topic, it's like, when we solve this, we'll solve all the other issues. And one should also be wary, I think in Europe it's not as hard as in some other places. The insistence, for example, even on liberal rights in certain situations for example, in some African countries, the insistence on, for example, LGBT rights, I would argue that in certain situations, it even brought societies to a more traditional stance towards even other issues. It's this is activist, kind of, at least from an activist standpoint, not from a theoretical standpoint. This is especially the case when you have these kind of, yes, you can use the funds, but only if you X. It's it can be a very problematic issue. Earlier, we were talking about generations of rights, and I think it makes sense to speak about generations of rights. So we had some political rights, then we evolved some social rights, then we spoke about these social rights, and eventually we have some rights that have been recognized as contemporary rights that are not even social political, like access to certain kinds of technology, broadband internet, and so on and so on. I think that these rights were actually categorized in a good way, in the sense that to people who don't have the first generation rights, usually if you try to sell them the second generation rights, it doesn't go very well, because you're trying to, in a situation in which the dominant form of discrimination or the dominant form of disadvantage is poverty, and in its radical form, radical poverty, kind of introducing the idea of kind of non-traditional forms of, or like the possibilities of change, it's pointless in many situations. And I don't mind pointless stuff. Pointless stuff is nice. But the problematic thing is that it creates a reaction, usually a right-wing traditionalist reaction with the society, that I think one has usually to be wary of.
I agree with you that it creates a reaction, because I can see it now in the world. But on the other hand, when you go from the perspective of the LGBT person, for her, it's like it's the first generation of rights, because from that individual perspective.
Yeah.
It's like the right for existence. Like my friends usually say, I don't have anything to talk about with someone who disagrees with LGBT theories and everything, because that's the reason of my existence. I don't debate about that.
I don't debate on my identity.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's not. Let me put it like this. For example, but even in these situations, you have one basic recognition, in the sense that you have still a lot of places where homosexual behavior is criminalized.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you go to a place where homosexual behavior is criminalized and speak about trans rights, you can, of course. Mm-hmm. But it's like bashing your head against the wall, and you know this. This is a basic right to life. So we start from somewhere. I know that people who are in a certain situation are they start from their situation. You're fighting for a right that you don't have. It doesn't make sense to fight for a right that you already is guaranteed to you and that it's effective within a society. But if you consider this situation, like the British situation in the 60s, Herbert Hart, one of the most important legal theorists, was a married homosexual. It was criminalized. He wrote a book about the criminalization of homosexuality in Great Britain. To great influence, it was criminalized during his lifetime, and so on and so on. He still stayed in that marriage, though he was notoriously homosexual, but he was, and I think his wife knew about. There's a great book. Nicola Lacey, actually, who is a very important feminist theorist, legal theorist, she also wrote a book about Herbert Hart, biography of Herbert Hart, and it's very well evidenced this situation.
It was pro-criminalization.
No, against. Basically, it was criminalized in Great Britain. homosexual behavior until a very late point. In many situations, we don't take into account this disparity. In some countries, you actually have the social situation and legal situation in much the same way that the legal and social situation was in the 70s in Great Britain. In the 70s in Great Britain, if you came, or in the 60s, and started to talk about like gender issues or intersectional issues that started prominence in the 90s, I mean, doesn't make much sense. That from an activist standpoint. From a theoretical standpoint, it's always kind of, let's discuss, of course.
But it depends on actually your audience. If you are talking with rural women, they would be interested in the topic of rural women. So that's actually what the intersectionality is.
Yeah.
And we can go back to the practicing trial lawyer. When they introduce maternity leave, that's intersectionality. Maternity leave is you being a mother. So that's you have additional identity aside of being a woman. So maybe we cannot just like circle it with okay, this is but it is.
Definitely.
So
No, but the only it's a strongly još uvijek samo predavanje, vidite. Aj čujemo se, zvaćete kad završim, molim. Ali ajde, baš, dok ovo. Znam. Dobra ideja. Pa dođi, hoću, dobra ideja i to. Pa dođi, evo ti dođi na predavanje, evo me u CLF-u, ajde. Savršit ću za 10 minuta. God Almighty. Dobro. The point is activist, and it's actually this point. The auditoriums are the point. So, and your starting point is the point. I mean, I'm very radical when it comes to discussing these issues. It's just when you want to achieve something society-wise, I think that the contextual approach is better suited to target, to make a difference. At least I think. And usually this thing, in order to make a difference, when you talk with rural women, you can get them interested into rural women issues, maternity leave, mothers, you can get them interested into mothers issues. But in legal terms, somebody in the society has to vote for this. And mothers will not be the majority in the parliament, rural women will not be the majority in the parliament, and so on and so on. Usually your issue will be how to get as many women as needed in the parliament. And you know our rules, for example, which are not respected oftentimes. With 40% of the women on a list, parliamentary list, has to be women, and so on and so on. Now, for example, if you go it's the same thing. If you go to courts and advocate for women in courts, it's a senseless thing to do in Serbia because 70% of judges in Serbia are women. It's we solved that issue. But intersectionally wise, you can ask yourself, okay, but why there are not 70% women trial lawyers, but like maybe 20% women trial lawyers?
But that's also because of, I'm sorry for interrupting, because of patriarchal norms in the society.
Yeah, but that's also because
of patriarchal norms in the society, because a job of a judge or a prosecutor is more secure. You have like a job frame from 9 to 5 or 8 to 4, and you then go home. But for a lawyer, and that's suitable for a mother with the kids and so on. But for a trial lawyer, you don't have working hours. You have to go to the prisons in the middle of the night, and that job is based on recognition, and it takes a lot of risks, and risk is not suitable for women. So in that case, men are more allowed to take that risk on than a woman who needs to take care of the kids and has to have a 9 to 5 job.
That's a great explanation of the situation. That's the very reason why these social norms are the very reason why women, who are the majority, like 70% of enrolled students at the Faculty of Law, are women. And the representation is adequate for courts, but not adequate for the work of trial lawyers, because trial lawyers basically, in order to do their work well, have to be available 24/7. Women want to realize themselves usually as mothers and as caring mothers, but also want to realize themselves professionally. And in order to realize yourself professionally, both as a caring mother and as a lawyer, you would do better. It's more rational for you, given the existing social norms, to pick the judicial profession than to pick the lawyer's profession. And you're absolutely right about that. Even if women would probably make better litigators than men, at least kind of like it makes a lot of sense, especially since, I mean, generally speaking, my female students on the Faculty of Law are better than on average, are better than my male students. And there's definitely more women, especially in the first years. They're far ahead of male students in the first 2-3 years of the faculty. I mean, I always joke in the amphitheater in the first year that I would disallow men to enroll at the faculty before the 21, and I would allow women from 18. It's absolutely fine, but kind of, yeah, it's not anything empirical. I don't have it empirically, but it's a result of my interaction for 20-something years with students. You can see women in kind of a median woman at the age of 18. It's much more ready to undertake the obligations arising from university life and academic life than a man at the same age. So usually, if you wanted to make a rule, I would just take a break for 2 years that you enroll in the faculty as a mature guy than usual. But yeah, Una, I agree.
Can I just ask one more thing?
Yeah.
Do you maybe have the statistics, or maybe doesn't have to be a strict number, but how many male and female professors you have on the faculty, and how many male and female assistants or demonstrators do you have? Is it a equal number?
I can check for you tomorrow and send you I'll send you.
You can count for tomorrow. I'm sorry.
No, it's very easy to check because of maybe it's even available online, but we can easily check. We have that list of professors usually, and I would have to count it. It's not kind of nastavnici. Spisak nastavnika I saradnika. This is not very useful. This is by number. I'm going to check it tomorrow and let you know. I'm not really. I mean, I know that women are well represented in all categories, but I cannot vouch for the number of whether it's 50-50 or whatever. I don't really know. I find the situation on Introduction to Jurisprudence, which I teach in the first year, terrible in this situation because 2 of our female professors retired, and they have been changed basically by female teaching assistants. We actually had only one teaching assistant, and it was a male teaching assistant. And now we're in a situation there is like 4 professors and 1 teaching assistant. We are all male. It's even aesthetically unbearable, let alone ethically unbearable. So now I'm just in a position I'm not voting for anybody who is a male anymore. It's just not allowing that to happen. Though you have this situation, Una, for example, in many areas, like the area of Introduction to Jurisprudence and Philosophy of Law, it's kind of, if you make, how do we call this in English, Bewerbung, if you open a position, there's no chance in hell that you'll have an equal amount of female applicants and male applicants. In essence, more male applicants will be interested in philosophy of law, if any female applicants. And it's not just a Serbian thing, it's a thing all around Europe. It's not very common for women to kind of get interested in philosophy of law. I mean, of course, it's still this thing where you have equality of opportunity, but some social... You have this entire discussion, for example, in STEM disciplines in the United States. So in technical and natural sciences, the representation of women is far less. In programming, the representation of women is far less. In certain occupations, the representation of women is far less. So when it comes to judges in Serbia, I agree completely with Tuna, but having more female judges than male judges is welcome, actually. But at least and this is a discussion that we're having. You take what you can at a certain point, because not everywhere the situation is such. In the United States, for example, you have reasons maybe to even introduce some gender equality rules, legal rules that regulate the number of female judges in the profession. But in Serbia, at least, you do not have these rules. But of course, I agree completely that there might be ways of increasing the number or the possibilities of women working in the advocacy or the trial lawyers profession. Okay. Let me just advance, otherwise my wife will kill me if I spend 20 more minutes on the presentation. How do you become a trial lawyer when you're an intersectionalist? You finish a faculty of law, get inscription, congrats, women are in, of course. But when you take a look around, who else is in? Is it too rich, too white, too straight, too privileged? And that is actually the intersectionalist question. Even if you take a look at all it's very difficult that you'll find a Roma judge. It's very difficult that you'll find a judge who is not a female judge who is not from an affluent family. It's very difficult that you find a judge who grew up in Vranje and it's a judge in Belgrade. It's very
or with a disability, God forbid.
Oh God! It's impossible to get to the court if you have a disability. So
You can't enter the building.
You can't enter the building, basically. So it's difficult. Like the faculty of law is a building that you can enter, but not from the front side. You have to enter through gates and like so on and so on. So of course, the intersectionalism also has its fair share of problems, which give rise to fantastic debates. Some of those we discussed tonight, but there will be chances to discuss many more of these situations. The problematic thing is that the analysis, speaking about intersectionality, would you join us, Eva? I have to finish the lesson. Please do not interrupt me overly, because I'm finishing in 2 slides.
Okay.
Do you want to sit with us?
No, I don't want to interfere, but I will listen from the background.
You're not interfering. I'm just finishing by bashing Dragica's intersectionalism. No, I'm not.
Transportation has arrived, and that's why he needs to finish the lesson.
We were just... Oh, God. Sit here, please. Sit. Okay, so the problematic thing is that the intersectional analysis in certain points becomes overly complex. Okay, we were giving these examples where, like, being a Roma woman is kind of a deprivileged position when you compare it to being a woman, but kind of being a Roma man when you compare it to being a woman, white woman, you're not really kind of sure. Or being a kind of, when you combine being a poor woman versus being an affluent or a rich Roma woman. Its intersectionality gets you into very weird matters of morally comparing incomparable moral categories. And when you want to justify these situations, especially legally wise, when you're changing some regulation, it's very difficult to change it. I can always ask you the question, what is your justification for privileging a certain category, even if it's an intersectional category, and not privileging another category, for example. And always the problem when you have a course instrument like law is emphasizing and overemphasizing individual differences can actually leave you completely out of the possibility of criticizing existing law. And some intersectionalist issues have in fact become not only legal issues, but factual issues. So you arrive at certain situations in intersectionalist discussions in which you actually escape completely from the possibility of legal regulation, and you enter into something that's not even related to the possibility of formulating a coherent political request. If you overemphasize individual differences and you de-essentialize completely, for example, gender, you're not really sure what you're left with. Mm-hmm. So if you say, for example, especially in these gender fluid issues, if you say like you have 5, 10, 11 genders, how do you accommodate for this? Is it possible to legally regulate the accommodation from a legal perspective? I mean, of course, in discourse, in terms of acceptance, in terms of recognition,
discrimination,
absolutely, that is fine. But when it comes to forming a coherent political position, you can compare it to any form, for example, of discrimination. Let's say a discrimination of a national minority, and you have like a clear political formulation of the anti-discrimination measures for national minority. For example, we are underrepresented in the parliament. Let's make one space where we do not have our language. Let's introduce the language as one of the dominant languages. But if you de-essentialize things completely, like there is a tendency to de-essentialize, for example, sex, gender, it becomes somewhat problematic. Is there any representation that isn't direct participation? That's highly dubious. How do you formulate a political request? Can you formulate a political request? Then debates have the tendency to sometimes revolve around something that's unrelated to law completely. I mean, they might be morally justified, but it's outside of legal competence, basically. So this gave rise to all these debates. In fact, I think that even it gave rise to this hotly debated issue between J.K. Rowling and the rest of the world, for example, or between... I still can't remember the name. I think that the surname is Stark. But I'm going to post this along with these other issues. I'm going to post her discussion about gender and sex. So it makes for interesting discussion, but it makes for problematic regulation. Why is this screwed up? Okay. Now, what do we theorize about today? The point of the entire presentation is that there's a very strong strand of feminism, basically giving you these glasses to analyze social and legal situations. They are very, very insanely valuable, and it's still a valuable thing to put on these glasses. Like, even if you take into account liberal feminism, there is plenty of things to change from the perspective of equality of opportunity. If you take into account radical feminism, there's plenty of things to change in terms of some social relations of power that cannot or are not addressed by legal norms in terms of eliminating these differences by using legal tools that are at your disposal. If you take into account intersectionality, it opens up an entire world of discriminating situations that might not even or cannot be or are not in the purview of law at all in these situations. Now, not many of these situations in Western societies are nowadays perpetuated by legal solutions, by equality of opportunity. In this sense, the radical feminist ideas and the intersectional feminist ideas, and Dragica is right in emphasizing them, are way more radical and way more poignant than these liberal ideas. In fact, liberal feminism nowadays is even sometimes used as an argument from conservative rightist critics of contemporary feminism to claim, for example, like the usual argument is, what do you want? You have basically equal, you are guaranteed your equal rights by law. But as Una emphasized, in our situation, even if you have an equal right to become a trial lawyer, you factually cannot become a trial lawyer, because either you can explain it by the patriarchal structure of the society, or by competing interests, or by the strong expectation that women takes care of the children, takes care of the house, and we turn back to our conception of the private that I'm sure you discussed with Dragica. Next time we talk about legal concepts. Hopefully you talk with Miodrag Jovanovic about legal concepts from feminist perspective. He's way more conservative than I am, and you'll have the chance to bash him on legal concepts and to yell at him. I'm going to try to make him at least make this presentation about legal concepts. It's always fun when you get somebody who's more conservative, you can yell more. When you get somebody who's Miodrag is fine about that. I joke always that Miodrag's favorite movie, he always watches dramas, and it's usually like about LGBT issues in Iran. They're his favorite movies, and I always bash on him that like kind of does it when he suggests a movie. I know that it's a movie about like a kid from Iran who is gay.
That's a weird genre.
It's a weird genre. There is a lot of these movies. It's very weird genre.
Or it makes perfect sense, if you ask me.
Yeah, but I just don't like dramas, no matter how many. I'm like a thriller horror kind of guy.
Bacha Boys, is that the Bacha Boys? You know, the dancing boys.
No.
That's I think
I know what you're talking about, Dushanka, yes, I think.
You will have stuff to talk about with Miodrag. Just mention movies. Absolutely, no. Yeah. No, because I have a general dislike of dramas. That's my reason. Otherwise, I'm completely fine with these movies, and I like torturing Miodrag Jovanovic. That's, for the record, I like torturing Miodrag Jovanovic. Well, hopefully, with the recording, Dragica is satisfied. Sorry to keep you for 2.5 hours almost. We'll have the chance to kind of discuss these issues further. Thank you for sticking with me, guys, and see you soon. Hopefully you haven't been bored out of your mind.
Professor,
Tell me. Laku noć.
as well.
Thank you for the lecture, Professor. Goodbye.
Thank you for your attendance. Bye.
Good night.